William Niven injects an important geopolitical reality into his essay on Naked Among Wolves. Quote, "But balanced truth was not the criterion when it came to representing the past in the GDR, or in any state, for that matter." End quote. Propaganda is a pejorative frequently applied to ideas not compatible with a nation's preferred narrative, yet the manipulations and careful framing of historical events to further a political agenda is the bread and butter of any sovereign nation, regardless of democratic or communist ideology being advanced. The narrative of Nazi persecution reflected in the media produced and consumed in the GDR prior to reunification served an important purpose by, quote, "not so much for educating the public about the past, but rather as a polemic hammer to use against West Germany," end quote. The Holocaust trials of the 1960s were the focus of East German programming, not to bring understanding of Jewish suffering during the Nazi period, but to call out the hypocrisy of failed denazification in West Germany and to question the legitimacy of a regime inundated with former Nazis and collaborators, such as Hans Glabke, contributor to the Nuremberg Laws. Though largely driven by the desire to further GDR ideology, the state-controlled media programming was influenced in part by a concern of increasing market share. Despite the critical eye of the East German viewer to GDR programming, survey data clearly demonstrated the success of the propaganda message about the Nazi past on the collective psyche. Wolfgram concludes his analysis by noting that despite frequently viewing West German television, East Germans failed to incorporate the full scope of the Holocaust and extent of Jewish persecution into their collective memory, which he attributes to the lack of public discourse space, public memorialization, and a dearth of coverage in other media outlets such as newspapers or cinema. The narratives that were spread distanced the viewers from the Nazis and a sense of personal responsibility. And one of the driving forces behind this marginalized reality has to do with the Marxist view of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And in that context, both Naked Among Wolves and Jacob the Liar reflect the period after the Berlin Wall has been built, when the political and cultural narratives surrounding the Holocaust begin to change. The Marxist theory of the Holocaust placed the blame on fascist capitalism first and foremost, going so far as to implicate Jews in their own destruction as members of the capitalist class. As exploiters of the workers themselves, Jews were socialized to view communism as evil, failing until too late to see the dangers of fascism. Framing the narrative as forced confinement with socialists and other, quote, victims of fascism, end quote, led to a shared solidarity of purpose, focused the war as a triumph of Soviet socialism over Western capitalism, but also minimized the Jewish experience in the collective cultural memory of East Germans. Bathrick's analysis posits that East German anti-fascist narrative of the concentration camps as a shared victimization of all political prisoners, thus reducing the Jewish victim to a minor player, going as far as to suggest it was not race, but anti-communism that drove Nazi ideology, of which anti-Semitism was merely a tool of manipulation. It is important to consider the changing geopolitical situation facing the East German state when contextualizing both Naked Among Wolves and Jacob the Liar. They represent the different roles that the victims played in their own narrative, and as an artifact of Nazi barbarism. The fact that in Naked Among Wolves there is ample use of the communist symbol of persecution, the White Triangle, but not even one instance of the Star of David, and the only references at all to the Jewishness of any of the prisoners is the racial slur used against the Polish man when he drops the suitcase outside of the camp, and later the references to the boy in the suitcase as that Jewish boy. This is in direct reflection of the East German stance of trying to establish their own political legitimacy after World War II as one of anti-fascist liberators rather than collaborators, and a generalization of victimhood rather than choosing to highlight the racial aspects, which, as previously discussed, the Marxist theory was one of a class struggle rather than racial. The absence of official Holocaust remembrance of victims of concentration camps in East Germany during the 1950s had begun to change in 1958 when Buchenwald Camp was inaugurated as the first of three, quote, national warning and memorial sites, end quote. The use of the boy to create tension between the members of the resistance humanizes the political prisoners and sets up the question of, are we willing to forsake this innocent simply to accomplish the greater goal? And I think the fact that it became yet another way of showcasing that the communists were in fact differentiating themselves from the Nazis by showing a humanity, even if it didn't involve portraying the Jews overtly as victims. The victims largely were those political prisoners who were being punished as a result of their attempting to thwart the Nazi camp leadership. The ending, which is a frenzied push toward an uncertain freedom, sets up the GDR narrative of conquering fascism from within rather than waiting to be liberated by the Americans. Camp officers show their culpability when disguising themselves as civilians and making decisions based on whether or not they will be hung as war criminals. Pippig's sacrifice for others marks this film's context in the GDR aesthetic, to sacrifice oneself for the collective. And I'm very struck by the changing nature of the visual representation. If you notice the original 1967 theater poster and the 1963 poster from the premiere, both really showcase that anti-fascist message of the film. But by the 2000s, both in 2003, we see this the Star of David being superimposed, and sort of a collective putting both the resistance and the idea of saving this child together really shows that changing position that the Holocaust had within the common understanding. And the clip I chosen really, again, goes to the point of showcasing that this is the story of a fight between the anti-fascists and the importance of the difficulty of maintaining your humanity in such a tough position.
Ich weiß nicht, ob ihr alle Kommunisten seid. Ich bin einer. Hört mir gut zu, damit ihr begreift, wie ich es meine. Wir haben hier im Lager ein kleines Kind versteckt. Seinetwegen sitzen zwei im Bunker. Seinetwegen hat sich unser Pippig totschlagen lassen. Und seinetwegen haben viele andere den Arsch riskiert. Hätten wir das Kind am Tor abgegeben, dann lebte Pippig noch. Allerdings hätten sie dann das Kind totgeschlagen. Auch das wäre nicht so schlimm gewesen, was? Hättest du das Kind bei der SS abgegeben? Siehst du? So schwer ist die Entscheidung über Leben und Tod. Meint ihr, es fällt mir leicht, Todestransporte zum Schoß zu schicken? Was soll ich machen? Soll ich glücklich sagen, ich verweigere den Befehl, schieße mich über den Haufen, großartig von mir. Ihr würdet mir bestimmt ein Denkmal setzen. Aber ich verzichte auf die Ehre. Ich schicke dafür Menschen in den Tod, um Menschen zu retten. Begreift ihr das? Sagt mir, haben wir Pippig in den Tod getrieben, weil wir das Kind gerettet haben? Hätten wir das Kind umbringen lassen sollen, um Pippig zu retten? Na, sagt es doch. Na, wer gibt mir die richtige Antwort? Ja.
Kameraden, die Front bewegt sich weiter. Langensalza und Eisenach sind gefallen. Es geht auf Erfurt zu.
Seid ihr verrückt geworden?
Alle Widerstandsgruppen halten sich befehlsbereit. Die Waffenverstecke werden besetzt. Für den ganzen militärischen Apparat Alarmstufe 2. Kameraden. Vielleicht ist das unsere letzte Nacht.
what we see with that clip is again, the military response, but also the struggle of the camp elder in trying to decide, again, making these life and death decisions, but clearly structuring it within the collective anti-fascist message. And yet what it doesn't really address is the fact that these political prisoners were actually carrying out the role and the function of capos and basically doing all the functions of the camp. And they were in fact perpetrators in a way. They were facilitating much of the brutality against the other prisoners. But here, of course, it's used just to demonstrate this idea of a righteous war that will hopefully result in the establishment of East Germany as the, again, anti-fascist nation. Now, we turn to Jacob the Liar, where depolitization is really going to change the focus of the narrative in East German media. Ward argues that Jacob the Liar's film approach, void of cliched visual strategies and political discourse, reflects not only an attempt to make history more relatable to contemporary audiences. This depoliticized and universal approach was accepted by East German authorities as a means to gain international recognition. Jacob the Liar didn't adhere to the standard anti-fascist narrative. It could appeal to an international audience without being criticized for upholding state propaganda. And yet, Diva's most famous Holocaust film, and the first film to truly link the representation of Jews with a theme of resistance, portrayed a much more nuanced form of resistance. Bayer's films challenged East German attitudes about who were fighters and victims by showing how individuals could practice defiance even in concentration camps and ghettos. Quote, according to the Marxist view, the Nazis drove the Germans to anti-Semitic excesses only to distract them from the society's latent class conflicts. Furthermore, as did their West German counterparts, East German intellectuals and artists tended to portray Jews as the passive victims of Nazism, end quote, from Wolfgram. Now, here we also see Jacob as well addressing this issue of doing what he thought was best for the group when being questioned about putting everyone in danger for his lies about the radio.
Ah, ein seltener Besuch. Bitte. Bitte.
Vermutlich können Sie sich denken, weswegen ich Sie aufsuche.
Wegen Lina? Geht es ihr wieder schlechter?
Nein, nein. Ich komme, weil ich mit Ihnen über Ihren Radioapparat sprechen möchte.
Na schön. Einer mehr oder weniger.
Verstehe nicht?
Sie wollen auch Nachrichten hören.
Im Gegenteil. Ich bin gekommen, um Ihnen Vorwürfe zu machen. Längst hätte ich das schon tun sollen.
Vorwürfe?
Ich weiß nicht, werter Herr Heim, von welchen Beweggründen Sie sich leiten ließen, als Sie die bewussten Informationen verbreiteten. Aber ich kann mir nur schwer vorstellen, dass Sie sich wohl überlegt haben, welcher Gefahr sie uns alle dadurch aussetzen. Und ganz besonders die Bewohner dieses Hauses. Muss ich Ihnen wirklich erklären, wo wir leben?
Aber nein.
Und doch scheint es mir angebracht. Sie sollten sich anders verhalten.
Wie?
Behalten Sie Ihr Wissen für sich.
Und dann? Haben Sie ein einziges Mal gesehen, mit was für Augen Sie mich um Neuigkeiten bitten? Hä? Wissen Sie, wie nötig Sie eine gute Nachricht brauchen? Wissen Sie das?
Ich kann es mir lebhaft vorstellen. Trotzdem...
Aber bleiben Sie mir doch vom Leib mit Ihrem trotzdem. Natürlich weiß ich selber, dass die Russen dann auch nicht schneller kommen, und wenn ich sonst was erzähle. Ihr Weg bleibt derselbe. Aber ich will Sie auf etwas anderes aufmerksam machen. Seit sich die Nachrichten im Ghetto herumgesprochen haben, ist mir kein Fall bekannt geworden, dass sich jemand das Leben genommen hätte. Ihnen? Vorher waren es viele. Ich weiß, wie oft man sie gerufen hat. Meistens war es zu spät. Vielleicht ist es Zufall. Vielleicht auch nicht.
Ward talks a lot about the idea of how Jacob the Liar is really an anomalous example of the East German cultural memories of the Holocaust. And basically the foregrounding of Jewish victimhood is in fact what makes it stand out. But I think that is an important factor to consider, given, again, the timing. This was later in 1974, and the reality was the world was becoming more aware, and this idea of persecution, specifically of the Jews, was really pushing its way forward. It allowed the more nuanced approach. And finally, the use of the child in both Naked Among Wolves and Jacob the Liar is a symbol of innocence, of a future, the best in humanity. But it's used in both films to illustrate different forms of resistance against the Nazis. Jacob the Liar challenged East German perspectives on resistance by showing nuanced forms of defiance, particularly through the agency of Jewish characters. At the end of the film, with her question, Lena leaves the audience to consider the history that she represents, whether this moment that might be one of her last, and whether something miraculous might happen to save her. It also demonstrates the power of imagination and its possibility to give people strength in harrowing situations. For both Lena and the adults for whom Jacob fabricates stories preserve their humanity despite the Holocaust and the Nazi efforts to dehumanize the Jews. Lena's faith in the imaginary cotton cloud is as strong as the adults' belief in fictitious Russian liberators. Their hopeful imaginations are bittersweet as they cling to life through Jacob's fabricated narratives, which are, in reality, unfounded.